Greetings and salutations, travelers, and welcome back to the Inn of Planar Crossroads. And also, welcome to the next episode in our How to Play series called Laws of the Multiverse. Last time, we covered the mechanical portion of attributes and discussed assigning scores. Now it's time to understand the theming of the attributes, and thus the why of your characters having scores in specific areas. Open legend attributes are, well, pretty open. Like we covered in the character concept episode, a single attribute can cover many different themes. We're going to discuss the attributes in order that they are listed in the book, meaning physical first, followed by mental, then social, and finally extraordinary. We have 18 of these to cover, so let's get to it. We begin covering the physical attributes with agility. This attribute affects a character's guard, one of the defenses, their initiative, and is useful for characters that are wanting to be very dexterous. In combat, this can be expressed as a catkin huntress, using it to shoot an arrow from her elven bow. Or maybe a mystic monk, making some precise martial arts strikes to block an opponent's chi. Outside of combat, a secret agent might use it to sneakily infiltrate a complex and engage in undetected espionage. This could also come into play if the cliff where the final battle is happening starts to crumble. Your LM could let you roll to avoid falling into the lava with the big bad. Fortitude comes next. Fortitude affects your toughness, another of the 3 defenses, and also hit points. Fortitude tends to be an attribute that is used in response to other things happening to your character. For example, resisting the poison that secret agent snuck into your drink, or enduring the harsh elements of a sandy desert or snow-driven peak. We could, however, see someone also using fortitude in a more creative way. Perhaps you can flavor a type of magic to be driven by a character's own vitality, and thus rolling their fortitude not just to attack your enemies, but also prevent backlash to their own hit points. If you want to try this type of thing, though, you'll need to look at an attribute substitution feat. We'll be talking all about feats and such later, so just file away that blood mage idea for now. Might, like agility, is an easy attribute to understand. It is basically the character's total physical strength. Anytime that cyber dwarf trooper swings his warhammer down on the gob of a chaos spawn, might will be rolled against one of the spawn's defenses. This is true for almost any strength-based thing you do. If you were to play a martial arts grappler, this attribute comes to mind, though that tends to involve more banes that we'll be discussing later. Out of combat, it is useful too. Perhaps you want to go full Samson on the city gates, so your character and their party can escape. Roll that might check to see if you can rip the gates right off their huge hinges and carry them off. I think y'all get the idea. The mental attributes start with learning. This score is most similar to the traditional idea of intelligence. It represents a character's book knowledge. Studious characters likely have higher scores in this attribute. The arcane studies of an aged under-elf wizard in their subterranean tower could fall under this.
As could the botanical research of alien plant life by your neo-alchemist on the party's spaceship.
Recalling certain facts from those studies that you as a player might not know can require a learning roll if the information you're looking for is more obscure than usual. While this type of roll is usually done out of combat, it can also be useful in combat, since the Elvish technician in the party might have pertinent information on the weaknesses of the Megagolem the group is attempting to disable, preferably with as little damage as possible so that he can use it for himself. Logic is something of a companion attribute to learning. Logic can be said to represent the character's functional knowledge. The comparison to how D&D and Pathfinder use wisdom as a companion to intelligence is understandable, but only partly accurate. The Elvish technician from before might have lots of education about that Megagolem. But if he wants to do some impromptu repairs to use it as an eventual ally, he may need the help of some goblin mechanator's logic to improvise some repairs with the limited battlefield supplies. In this example, we see another way to understand the relationship between the two attributes. Learning's effects revolve around software, while logic's revolve around the hardware. A hobgoblin gunslinger might have the logic to know how to use and repair his revolver, but not the learning to understand the scientific principles behind its function. The book also mentions using logic to break codes and understand new languages easier by puzzling them out. An interesting point, since a case could be made for both learning and logic to fit the bill in this respect. Getting right down to it, these two scores are complementary to each other, so whether one will apply, or perhaps both would, is going to depend heavily on how your character intends to utilize that attribute. Being creative with the use of your attributes is something that Open Legend very much encourages. We come to perception now. It functions pretty much like you would expect it to. If you want to see all the things, then this is probably the non-extraordinary attribute to invest in. You'd likely see an observant man-bird sky druid using this to spot a foe hiding amongst the reeds as he soars high above the ground. Or that catfolk huntress from earlier using it for tracking some elusive prey through the forest. Perception can also represent a character's intuition and the aptitude they have for sussing out the shady shopkeep's sneaky schemes. It is probably one of the most rolled stats in any game, not just Open Legend, so putting an extra point or two in it along your character's journey never hurts. Definitely a solid investment. Will is the last of the mental attributes, but certainly not the least. It affects two of a character's defensive scores, toughness and resolve, as well as their overall hit point total. If fortitude represents your character's physical resilience, then will is their mental resilience. Will is a really good attribute to invest in. It can come into play in a wide variety of situations. For an easy example of its use, say a party of adventurers is journeying through the Underdark. The constant silence and darkness may begin weighing on them, resulting in them needing a successful will roll to resist turning back to their beloved sunlight and fresh air. A more academic need for a will roll might be with our previously mentioned aged under-elf wizard in his tower doing some intense study during the night. To stay coherent during this time, he must succeed in the roll, or risk not retaining some of that important information. For a final example, Here is one of my favorite uses for will.
In an old, abandoned, isolated house, a PI is investigating a lead on a missing person when his lantern illuminates more than he bargained for. He sees a tentacled monster forcing its way through the odd angle at the ceiling of the room.
A successful will roll here would stave off insanity long enough for him to attempt to rush out into the stormy night and flee into his Ford automobile. We've now reached the social attributes, which begin with deception. Despite the name of this attribute, it is fairly straightforward.
Our hobgoblin gunslinger from before might be participating in a high-stakes poker game. He better succeed his deception check to bluff about his cards, or he might lose his hard-earned bounty money with that jack-high hand.
It could be that in an intrigue game, the half-devil courtier doesn't exactly have a moral compass that points true north. He might rely heavily on his aptitude for distorting the truth to manipulate situations to his advantage, thus utilizing this attribute not only to lie, but also spread rumors about others within the court.
For a slightly different example, the neo-alchemist from before may have made a breakthrough in her research of that alien plant. But that same success now has her as a target of nefarious forces. She may need to go incognito for a while with a disguise.
The successfulness of that disguise will hinge quite a bit on the occasional deception roll. The next attribute up is persuasion. Persuasion and deception often have a close relationship during actual play, to the point that sometimes those lines can blur. Hopefully we can draw some clear distinctions in this video and get a better handle on their roles in-game.
We already know that the half-devil courtier will be utilizing deception to manipulate those around him. But what if he finds himself in a troublesome predicament, where lying would actually worsen his position, or even be impossible, like in a zone of truth? That is where having points in persuasion would become quite necessary for properly navigating the negotiation without revealing his previous misdeeds.
The gnomish dungeoneer tradesman from our jack-of-all-trades example would need to have a good score in persuasion to exchange those goods he got from his adventures and haggle the best deals out for himself and his party, something they will likely appreciate.
It is worth mentioning that this attribute is what
A foxfolk inquisitor might use to pry information from his sources. This could be through more or less diplomatic means, depending on the character.
presence is a fun attribute and can make for fun characters. The alien pop star from our previous video would likely have a high presence score to be able to use her vocal talents to help her friends in battle, and, of course, totally own her soul-out performance. Also, the cyber dwarf from earlier might invest a bit in this attribute for when he decides to intimidate his foes. It can really help sell that hardcore warrior persona he has going. Just in case anyone starts to doubt it when they see him melt over the cuteness of his battle buddy kitten. One of the most fun ways I've seen this used is actually in our 2019 Fallout Fort Smith game. Tommy used presence to represent how luck seemed to shine on his character Ash. This was fun both for the successes and the failures that were seen. I'll put a link below in the description in case you want to check it out for yourself. We arrive now at the extraordinary attributes, which begin with alteration. Alteration is a fun attribute to play around with because its uses are quite varied.
Perhaps our aged under-elf wizard from before, after successfully studying through the night, has learned to use his magical abilities to practice the forbidden flesh-meld magics of his ancestors, thus having it make sense for alteration to become an important attribute for him.
A more technological example might be that of our
Neo-alchemist using alteration to genetically engineer some of the flora her party grows in the ship's garden modules with the alien plants material she was studying before, allowing them to grow better in low light, saving extra power for the ship to use during its emergency warp jumps.
Then there is a classic example of what Addie's character Caesar does. He is a shapeshifter creation, so he relies a lot on this attribute and the shapeshift boon to morph into all different types of creatures that he has seen. A link to that game series, called Misadventures Continued, will also be in the description below. Creation has an interesting mix of things going for it. One of which is that points in this attribute can grant access to many of the healing boons and other support-based options you would see present in a classic white mage healer from a certain set of fantasy games that never quite seems to make good on their promise of finality. Interestingly though, if you want to play something more nefarious, like a Packmaster Conjurer, this attribute would be what you invested in, to summon those different entities from across the planes. You would need to succeed on your creation roll, otherwise things could go horribly wrong. These examples may make it seem like this attribute, along with many of the other extraordinary attributes, are more about magic than anything else. But let's remedy that misconception now by giving a techie example for creation. Say that our alien pop star needs to practice her show, but the ship's holodeck is not working quite right. So, she asks the crew's somewhat alcoholic engineer that normally uses his knowledge of hard light technology to create and maintain the ship's shields to try and fix the machine. A good roll on creation could let the simulation work as intended. A poor one could result in something similar to those dangerous holodeck episodes from a certain sci-fi series that boldly went where no one had gone before. Energy is really the most straightforward of the extraordinary attributes. Anything having to do with elemental forces falls under this one. When we were talking about theming, we mentioned that both the Space Ranger with his heat-based laser and the Cryo Specialist are using this attribute for their weaponry when traveling through the star systems, trying to keep their Pop Star and Neo-Alchemist out of trouble. Creatures with elemental abilities also use this attribute.
The iconic black dragon living in the swamp south of the city would use this attribute for their acidic breath attack and any pains such as persistent damage that would be associated with it.
Now might be a fun time to mention that playing what are traditionally thought of as monstrous races is actually quite doable in Open Legend. By that I mean that
this black dragon could be a potential ally or even party member with proper building.
I suspect that we'll be talking about that more later in the series. Finally, I feel we would be remiss when talking about energy if we didn't at least mention that the much beloved Fireball spell would be dictated by this attribute. Someone playing my favorite little anime explosion mage would definitely devote as much points as possible to this attribute, likely investing in a feat like attack specialization to further boost damage potential. Entropy is an attribute that could get a bad reputation because it is the main one associated with necromancy and death magic. After all, our villain from the last video, the Withered Hand, used it to attack the defenses of your character with necromantic energy. And yes, he also uses it to create undead, but that is far from all its uses. Say that the Sky Droid from before is responsible for preventing said undeath being created in his forest. He could invest in entropy and use it to rapidly decompose any deceased creatures he comes across, thus making them harder to raise. Entropy also has a place in various futuristic settings. That alcoholic engineer might have a few points in this attribute in order to use some disintegration phasers for self-defense. After all, his crewmates often take a ship through some more dangerous routes to shave time off the trip. You never know what could be waiting for you when you wake up from cryosleep. Influence is a fun attribute to play with. It covers a variety of different mind-based powers and abilities. The chi-blocking mystic monk from before might have taken a vow of silence and instead uses this attribute to speak directly into the minds of those she wishes to communicate with. This attribute could pull double duty in her build, since she could use it for any indirect chi manipulation she might do to influence the emotions of those around her, to instill fear, tranquility, excitement, etc. She has mastered them in herself, after all. Illusions of various natures can easily be accomplished using this attribute as well. Our goblin mechanator from before might have a whole bevy of different devices on his belt that not only create immaterial projections of himself to distract his enemies, but also cloak him with invisibility. Lots of fun can be had with this attribute, to be sure. Movement covers mostly what you would expect it to. The Sky Druid will have points here to be able to fly and properly maneuver in the air, especially during times of stress and or inclement weather. Fall damage is never fun to deal with mid-combat. Something fun to do would also have the shady shopkeep have some points here, so that should any of his little schemes go awry, he can teleport away from the PCs before they can enact their vengeance on the bothersome pest. Having him as a recurring annoyance to their purchasing plans could be more than a little amusing. Movement would also be where you invest points if you want to be able to push and move opponents around the battlefield. Our grappler from earlier could use this attribute to supplement his might for performing throws and trips on his adversaries without breaking the theming of his character. Remember that even if you have a character that doesn't dabble in the supernatural, there are still theming options for extraordinary attributes that can often work within those self-imposed limitations. Our penultimate attribute is presence. It is the other heavily mind-centric extraordinary attribute. This one focuses more on seeing and detecting things usually unseen.
The huntress we've used before might also have invested here to be able to see through the eyes of her woodland allies for scouting ahead, seeing what was coming the party's way. The Foxfolk Inquisitor we used as an example could have points in this one to assist his goals of gaining information. This could include not just the ability to read the minds and intents of his living targets, but I could see the argument for it to be used to communicate with those that have left their mortal coil. After all, the dead can't lie.
Coming back to our PI, due to his proximity to that eldritch horror, he might develop visions of possible futures accompanied by severe headaches. These premonitions could be represented by points in this attribute and thus used to the party's advantage. Seeing into the future is not something that is always easy to handle in games, so make sure to really iron out with your LM the expectations that you both have for using that type of ability and the theming of those abilities. Finally, we reach the end of the extraordinary attributes: protection.
The well-rounded warrior tactician from last time could have some points here so that when an arrow comes flying through the air towards his friend, the specialist wizard, he can roll to try and slice the missile right out of the air before it can even touch his squishy compatriot.
That same specialist abjure wizard could use this attribute to dispel, spell break, and otherwise counterspell any incoming supernatural attack that would threaten the warrior, making for quite the effective tag team.
For our last example,
let's say the Green Crusader has been questing to quell the threat of the Pact Master and his summoned minions. Such a character could have points in protection, so that once he has sufficiently weakened the summoned being, he can send it back to its original plane of existence with a banishing strike, utilizing this attribute.
All right, we made it through all the attributes. That took longer than I expected it would, but hopefully the time investment has rendered a useful and entertaining result. Thanks again to Kane and Levi for helping me read through some of these scripts before recording. Dan from Avenue Studios and the Great Mustache helped look over some of the descriptions too, so thank you to them as well. The next video in the series will go over defenses, hit points, and speed. It shouldn't take nearly the amount of work this last one did, so it should be along shortly. As we've said before, you can follow us on Facebook and Twitter to stay up on the progress of the series and get some quality memes. For a bit of an announcement, we're planning to start mirroring some of our content from YouTube onto BitChute, so you'll be able to like, share, and subscribe on either one of those sites if you wish. Having that backup site to post to takes a lot of worry off my mind when it comes to YouTube's constantly changing policies. Please put any questions, comments, and/or observations in the appropriate spaces below. We do read all of those interactions. Remember that if you like this content enough to support it, we have a Patreon and Subscribe Star where you can do just that. I'm not sure if you've noticed, but we don't have ads on this channel. I don't like sitting through them, so I don't want to make y'all do it either. It is only through your support that we can even think about putting out content in a quicker manner. Financially supporting us at any tier gets you access to our Discord. Doing so won't just help the End of Planar Crossroads release videos faster, but also provide content to take directly into your games. For example, I'm hoping to share some PDF content there for certain tiers once we get character builds and such going. Just something to think about. That is everything I have to say for now. Thank you so much for watching until the end. And, as always, have a great day. God bless, and enjoy.
This content was made possible by travelers and viewers like you. Thank you.